Today we will be studying Key Concept 9.2, Section 2. Following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, U.S. foreign policy and military involvement focused on a war on terrorism, which also generated debates about domestic security and civil rights. Essentially, we will be studying how the U.S. responded to attacks on the World Trade Center and how terrorism brought up questions about civil liberties and human rights. Part A of this key concept. In the wake of attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, U.S. decision-makers launched foreign policy and military efforts against terrorism and lengthy, controversial conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. This will be illustrated in the following timeline.
Ronald Reagan became President of the United States in January 1981. Reagan was a conservative president who believed in having a smaller government and a bigger military. Reagan was a president at the end of the Cold War, and his method of interacting with the Soviet Union was called bellicose rhetoric, which means demonstrating aggression or willingness to fight through the art of persuasive speaking or writing. Reagan did not only want to contain the Soviet Union, but rather defeat them. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and broke up into 15 different countries. This signified the end of the Cold War. It was not only a victory for the United States, but also for democracy around the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union resulted in the formation of new diplomatic relationships across the world. George W. Bush became President of the United States in January of 2001. Bush was a Republican whose presidency was more or less shaped by the terrorist attacks at the time. He was well known for the Bush Doctrine, the phrase used to describe various foreign policy principles. On September 11, 2001, during George Bush's presidency, something terrible occurred. Individuals associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes and carried out suicide attacks against targets in the United States. 2 airplanes were flown into the World Trade Towers, 1 plane was flown into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Over 3,000 people were killed and many more were injured. The U.S. invasion of Iraq occurred in order to shut down terrorist camps, destroy their plans, and bring them to justice, to prevent terrorist sponsors from threatening the United States, and to prevent terrorists from seeking nuclear weapons, which is known as preemptive war. This point of view was very similar to the one that pro-war expansionists would have taken during the War of 1812.
Part B of this key concept is that the war on terror sought to improve security within the U.S., but also raised questions about the protection of civil liberties and human rights.
The axis of evil was a term used by President George W. Bush for the Iran, Iraq, and North Korean governments who he accused of supporting terrorism. President Bush used the axis of evil to rally support for the war of terrorism in wake of 9/11 attacks. Libertarian spirit was the political philosophy of Americans that defends the individual right to life, liberty, and property. The libertarian spirit at the turn of the century influenced criticism of the USA Patriot Act and other wartime human rights violations. The USA Patriot Act was the uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism Act of 2001. This act gave law enforcement enhanced authority to pursue the war on terror initiated by President George W. Bush. Some civil libertarians of the era opposed this act due to human rights violations apparent in its scope. The Abu Ghraib prison was a set of human rights violations regarding the treatment of prisoners and suspected enemy combatants in the Abu Ghraib prison during the war in Iraq. Globalization occurred during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of independent states in 1989 through 1991, when the U.S. began the formation of new diplomatic relationships abroad. The Bush Doctrine was the foreign policy of the Bush administration. After 9/11, it was used to justify the 2001 invasion of Iraq in tandem with the unilateral policy of foreign involvement to fight the war on terror. 9/11 was the day in 2001 when Arab suicide bombers hijacked United States airliners to attack targets in the United States. This terrorist attack inspired the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, and the war on terror, all generally directed toward the Islamic extremist terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. Unilateralism was the doctrine that nations should conduct their foreign policies individualistically without the advice or involvement of other nations. This policy was put forth aggressively by President George W. Bush in 2002 in response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. President Bush asserted that the United States would do what is necessary for our nation's security and made it clear that other nations were not to be considered when our security was threatened. This policy may have roots in the isolationist attitudes of the pre-war eras. A preemptive war is a war initiated to gain a strategic advantage against a suspected enemy invader. President Bush launched a preemptive war against Al-Qaeda with the invasion of Iraq and the declaration of the War on Terror. The War on Terror was the national military campaign that began in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Although primarily directed towards organizations of Islamic extremists, this term initiated a broad defense against terrorism worldwide, provoking a unilateral policy of international involvement to ensure U.S. national security.
My name is Eli, once again. At this point, I'd like you to please hit pause and read pages 383 to 394 of your capital book. I would also recommend reading pages 1023 and 1032 of the AP US textbook. When you're done with the reading, turn to page 395 of the capital book and take the short quiz. I will go over questions 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9 when you are done taking the quiz. Those are the only questions I want you to answer. Welcome back to Answers with Eli. We're going to be going over the answers on the test you've just taken in the capital book. The answer to number 1 is D. The reason for that is because debates over national identity and democratic ideals. Because of the influx of new immigrants, it led to controversies and debates over national identity. The answer number 2 is A. A shifting of political powers to southern and western states. Because as immigrants settled in western and southern states, the population increased, giving them more political power. 3. The answer to 3 is B. Rise of an industrial culture in the Gilded Age. Because immigration also increased during the Gilded Age due to demand for labor. 8. The answer to 8 is B. Or Woodrow Wilson's call for defense of the democracy in 1917. Because the belief that the U.S. would take action against those who challenged liberty and freedom was similar to Wilson's call. 9. The answer to 9 is C. Debates about domestic security and civil rights. Because the attack on 9/11 led to increased security in the U.S., which led to increasing debates about the balance between security and citizens' rights.
At this point in the video, please hit pause and answer guided reading questions 8, 9, and 10. The answers can be found on pages 1028 through 1031 of the AP US textbook. When you're finished, press play and I will go over the answers.
Hey, Autumn, what was the U.S. hoping to achieve when they passed the USA Patriot Act?
Well, the 2001 U.S. Patriot Act, passed by George Bush, granted the administration sweeping authority to monitor citizens and apprehend suspected terrorists. The U.S. government was hoping to deter and punish terrorist acts in America and all around the world. This act, however, is quite controversial. Civil libertarians are extremely critical of the act and worry that invasion of privacy contradicts the civil liberties of American citizens as guaranteed by the Constitution. This question relates to Key Concept 9.2.2 Part A because it involves foreign policy against terrorism.
What followed the Bush administration's March 2003 invasion of Iraq?
Well, 3 countries, Iran, North Korea, and Iraq, were known as the Axis of Evil. Iraq was the preferred target since the Pentagon viewed Iraq as unfinished business from the Gulf War of 1991, and the U.S. hoped that invading Iraq would unveil America's supposed mission to democratize the world. Unfortunately, things did not turn out as we hoped. France, Germany, Mexico, Canada, and Turkey all condemned the invasion. America, caught up in its own nationalism, underestimated the strength of nationalism of the Iraqis. Ultimately, the Iraqis viewed Americans as invaders, and problems escalated when photos of American guards abusing suspected insurgents at Abu Ghraib prison were released. However, Bush decided that the United States would have to stay the course, or Iraq would fall into complete chaos. This relates to Key Concept 9.2.2 Part A because it involves military efforts against
Law
terrorism.
passed during the Obama administration fulfilled many long-standing Democratic goals.
The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010, also known as Obamacare, fulfilled a long-standing goal of the Democrats. It was enacted to increase the affordability of health insurance and lower the cost of health care for individuals. This was a big deal because it changed health care in America significantly forever. This question relates to Key Concept 9.2.2 Part B because it involves security and government policy.
Please pause the video and answer essential question 2 of set 2. When you're finished, press play and I will go over the answers. Now to answer how challenges in other parts of the world helped to reshape U.S. foreign policies. Events such as the Six-Day War, the Gulf War, and many other wars caused hatred in the hearts of those in the Middle East towards America. This caused some Middle Eastern Muslims to rise up and create radicalist groups that wanted nothing more to destroy America. This led to events such as 9/11, which then led to War on Terror, Axis of Evil, and the invasion of Afghanistan, and the declaration of war on Iraq. These changes caused Americans to view the Middle East and the Muslim culture, in which led to racial discrimination.